Welcome back to our series on why we're socialists and not liberals. We apologize for the long hiatus. Between work, DSA activities, vacation, and life in general, it's been tough to find time to work on this podcast, let alone time to record. But we hope that you'll think this episode was worth the wait. And apologize if you hear any sounds of cats meowing. We are a solidly working cat class podcast. We don't have a recording booth, and we're in our living room, so it might happen. So, we started this series on the premise that liberalism is not up to the challenges of our time, and only the Marxist socialist tradition is. We began by introducing the topic, gave a brief overview of the history of liberalism and socialism, and addressed the confusion caused by the faux radical politics of ultra-leftism. We now come to the challenge raised by the resurgence of far-right politics. We believe that liberalism, as an ideology, is incapable of responding adequately to the far right because of ideological blinders that prevent it from understanding what the far right actually is, and structural characteristics that prevent it from taking the necessary measures to protect itself. We will attempt to answer two questions. What is the far right, and why is liberalism incapable of responding to it? Then we will explain what a left-wing response to the far right would look like. First, we'd like to start with a discussion of the sources we'll be working from. All told, there was well over 2,000 pages of reading the two of us did in preparation for this episode. Much of it dry, academic text that we read so you don't have to. You're welcome. After this, we'll refer to the author by last name. So the first book was The Reactionary Mind by Corey Robin, which explains how conservatism has never really truly had fixed principles, but has always been a reaction to revolts by the underclass and really ultimately a defense of hierarchy and privilege. There's a Destruction of Reason by Hungarian-German Marxist Georg Lukács, which is a dense tome that traces the ideological and philosophical underpinnings of the far right back to 18th, 19th, and 20th century philosophers. The Authoritarian Personality by Theodor Adorno et al. Was a post-World War II study of factors that make some people more susceptible to fascism than others. Breaking the Impasse by Moody explains how socialists could break out of the two-party system, by making alliances, strategic organizing. Fascism, What It Is and How to Fight It by Leon Trotsky, which is a short contemporaneous book written in the 1930s in response to the original fascist movement. Yep. And Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, which is a philosophical defense of absolute monarchy, written by an Englishman who lived through the English Civil War, which was in the 1640s and 1650s.
So, what is the far right? It is more than just ignorant, racist, confused masses of hillbillies. Many American liberals clearly misunderstood who the average Trump supporter was. An analysis from the election website 538 found that the median income of Trump voters in 2016 was about $72,000 per year, too high for the white working class hypothesis to be plausible. Most actual working class voters either voted Democrat or didn't vote at all. While many working poor voters did support Trump, that's not where his hardcore base lies. In reality, the far right is centered in the petty bourgeoisie, that is, the small business owners, also known as the upper middle class. Having said that, a brief tangent on why we don't like the term middle class. For the non-socialists in our audience, there's a lot of baggage wrapped up in the words working class that might not be immediately obvious. We use the phrase because it is a part of the vernacular, but we do so grudgingly because it is so frequently misused. The Authoritarian Personality found that, quote, most Americans are psychologically middle class, unquote. People want to think of themselves as normal or average, but the problem is that when everyone is middle class, it blurs the lines of class struggle in their minds. If you're poor, you can imagine yourself not as poor, but instead as upwardly mobile. And if you're rich, you can imagine yourself as just another average American, even if you live in a gated community and drive a Mercedes S-Class. It is a fundamentally individualist conception of liberty, and accepting such a conception without criticism or analysis just plays into the hands of the ruling class. As Marxists, we want people to have a clear idea of their position in society. If you're working class, you're getting screwed one way or another, and we want people to be fully conscious of that. The idea of a middle class presupposes a substantial body of common interest between wage workers and small business owners that is mostly or entirely fictional. As much as we like Bernie in a lot of ways, his reliance on the phrase and idea of a middle class is, in our opinion, a weakness of his approach. Now, getting back on track, Many liberals, especially those with higher income and more education, seem to conflate the reactionary petty bourgeoisie, again that's the small business, small landlord class, with the lumpen proletariat. This term in Marxist jargon refers to the most economically precarious, least politically developed segment of the working class who are generally uninterested in revolution. This reveals the rather elitist, anti-populist mindset of many centrists and liberals. Surely only poor and uneducated people could have such bad politics or be this boorish and uncouth, etc. It is a common misconception among liberals that class is purely a matter of education level and income, which, according to Moody, author of Breaking the Impasse, creeps over into statistics. Because a portion of white male small business owners have similar education and take-home income to some higher-paid skilled workers, they tend to be lumped into the white working class in election statistics. There are also those labeled working class who lack college degrees and display certain cultural signifiers like wearing plaid, but own lucrative businesses, think Joe the plumber. The relevant detail here is that they are owners of capital, however small, with power over employees, and therefore, in many ways, have more in common with Jeff Bezos than a well-paid employee at Amazon corporate.
And for those people who don't get the reference, Joe the plumber was this guy who showed up at events in Ohio in I think it was 2008, and asked McCain and Obama both questions, and he famously got Obama accused Obama of saying, "Oh, you're going to raise my taxes," and I think that the response was that Obama tried to explain what marginal tax rates are, that if you're this guy is making $250,000 a year, he can afford to pay just a little bit more on his income over $250,000. But that's where the reference comes from. It's from the 2008 election.
To put this in pop cultural terms, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia is about the petty bourgeoisie, while Trailer Park Boys is about the lumpen proletariat. Of course, the lifestyle and affectations of most die-hard right-wingers ought to reveal what a misapprehension this is. Big lifted trucks, guns, and ammo are expensive. It's not broke yokels doing this stuff for the most part. Ironically, some of those people still self-identify as working class despite being obviously petty bourgeois, for the same reasons people falsely self-identify as middle class. As Adorno et al. Would argue, group identification can be more important than actual group membership.
We also need to state that the far right is not simply the entire conservative bloc in the United States, and certainly does not include Joe Biden or the Democratic Party. We're not going down that rabbit hole. I've had that argument too many times on Reddit and Facebook saying, no, the Democratic Party is not a right-wing party. Oh, geez. Granted, it is often difficult to draw qualitative distinctions between conservatism and the far right. There's a spectrum between the two that the far right is often on the extreme end of, but there's no clear dividing line where you can say that conservatism stops and the far right starts. And there are a few rules that one can use. One is that the far right seems to be far more willing to say the quiet part out loud. Conservatives have typically given lip service to pluralism and democracy, whereas the far right tends to reject them. Another is that the far right is more populist in the sense that legitimacy comes from the people and in embracing some redistributive social programs, while conservatives are strongly elitist. Perhaps related, while conservatives can be quite intellectual, think of William F. Buckley, Edmund Burke, George Will, these are people who are smart, have college degrees, went to Yale. The far right tends to be anti-intellectual. Ironically, many of them also went to Harvard and Yale. However, with the ongoing Trumpification of the Republican Party and the influence of far-right figures like Christopher Rufo, that's the guy leading the GOP war against trans kids, conservatism is rapidly moving towards the far right, so this may not be a relevant distinction for long. Also, there's more than just fascists on the far right. Think about your Christian dominionists, your theocratic Christian Taliban kind of types. And there are also differences between fascist movements, being products of the times and places where they've arisen. The Italian socialist Umberto Eco provides a useful list in his essay Fascism, which we recommend you go read. To summarize briefly, these features are extreme traditionalism, anti-modernism, militarism, anti-intellectualism, xenophobia, ultranationalism, superficial populism, and authoritarianism. Additionally, fascists have a tendency to steal certain motifs from radical left politics, like rhetorical anti-elitism, but then decontextualize them and steer them in a reactionary direction, diverting some people into its orbit in the process. This is why it shouldn't be surprising to hear fascists talking about social welfare programs, including the original Nazis, whose full name was the National Socialist German Workers' Party.
On that note, two books I want to mention really briefly. Against the Fascist Creep by Alexander Reed Ross gives a good short history of fascist ideology, including the tendency to hijack left-wing rhetoric and motifs, as well Insurgent Supremacists by Matthew Lyons deals with some of those other tendencies on the far right, at least in the U.S., like Christian Dominionists and so forth.
So, why is this group so reactionary? According to Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher popular with the far right and inspiration for Ayn Rand, these people are the furthest away from socialism as a doctrine of reform in the acquisition of property. Should they ever have access to the taxation screw through their parliament's large majorities, they will assault the principality of capital, businessmen and stock exchanges with progressive taxation, thus, in fact, slowly creating a middle class which may forget about socialism as it would a disease it had recovered from. In other words, it's the acquisition of property. While modern conservative doctrine abhors the use of progressive taxation, the thing to note here is that Nietzsche identified the means by which the rich attempt to fragment the working class, and to divide it against itself, and diffuse potential revolution from the left which might dispossess them of their investments. Instead, they prefer tax cuts and deductions, such as those on mortgage interest, which, while technically not the petty bourgeois, homeowners have a vested interest in opposing reforms such as social housing if it might threaten to lower home values. The capitalist ruling class understands that any successful defense of the status quo must involve the lower classes as more than passive participants. They need to have some skin in the game, some feeling that there is something in it for them. Because of this shared interest in the acquisition of wealth and the protection of their property rights, these petty bourgeois serve as useful tools for the enforcement of the capitalist class position and a bulwark against reform. This isn't a new phenomenon either. Back in the 1930s, Leon Trotsky characterized the original fascist groups in Italy and Germany as petty bourgeois movements being wielded by the big industrialists against the labor movements and socialists. This is from Fascism, What It Is and How to Fight It. The left, at least, parts of it, have known who these people were the entire time. So we were just talking about the petty bourgeois, the people with the lifted trucks, with huge gun collections, who live in the suburbs, etc. Unfortunately for them, having acquired wealth, they also acquired the anxiety that they might lose it. They realized that the American dream might not pay off for them, and they worried that their property interests were under threat. They feared that their fairly high standard of living might come to an end. The bootstrapping mentality shared by many of these people convinced them that they had earned everything that they had, and that the poor simply didn't work hard enough. So when the Great Recession wiped out billions of dollars in home equity and millions of jobs, and given them that many of them had already felt like they were getting screwed by the big banks and corporations, when they watched the Bush and Obama administrations bail out the banks, they got pissed off. But rather than blame the capitalist housing market, which turned houses into speculative investments, or decades of neoliberal policies under both Democratic and Republican presidents, as we would, they blamed poor people taking out home loans, immigrants, black people, and of course Barack Obama as the first non-white president. The combination of decades of economic decline, anger over bank bailouts, and a weak economic recovery then gave Donald Trump an opening to win votes by offering superficial economic populism and blaming all of their problems on immigrants, China, and the woke left. This is a common element to far-right propaganda. The idea that powerful elites and undesirable foreign elements are somehow in league with each other, which we'll come back to. To quote Trotsky, the despairing petty bourgeois sees in fascism, above all, a fighting force against big capital, and believes that, unlike the working class parties which deal only in words, fascism will use force to establish more justice.
Strongmen and hierarchy. Now, we've touched on another appeal of far-right politics, the embrace of hierarchy. Donald Trump won in 2016 by promising to be a strong man who would fight on behalf of the little guy against the quote-unquote globalists. He meant Jews. Sure, he was a big capitalist himself, but he was their big capitalist. There's an article from Jacobin describing Trump as a lumpen capitalist that we'll include a link to in the show notes. As argued in The Authoritarian Personality, fascism appeals to those who seek comfort in an uncertain world by putting a strong man in charge, such as the aforementioned Donald Trump, as well as others including Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil and Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines. The study found that for authoritarian personalities, submission to a strong authority figure is a way to overcome weakness by identifying with the strength of that figure and making it psychologically their own. They also look for systems within which there is opportunity for submission to the powerful and retaliation upon the powerless, such as the military and law enforcement. For another pop culture example, Cartman from South Park is a perfect parody of the authoritarian personality. The combination of bigotry, conspiratorial paranoia, and moral condemnation of others with total refusal to take responsibility for his own actions or their consequences. For you niche sci-fi nerds out there, Rimmer from Red Dwarf is another example in this vein. The 17th century French philosopher Rousseau observed that, quote, citizens only allow themselves to be oppressed to the degree that they are carried away by blind ambition. Since they pay more attention to what is below than to what is above, domination becomes clearer to them than independence, and they consent to wear chains that they may in turn give them to others. It is very difficult to reduce to obedience anyone who does not seek to command, unquote. This conclusion was apparently also reached by John C. Calhoun, the arch defender of slavery himself, who said that, quote, with us the two great divisions of society are not rich and poor, but black and white, and all the former, the poor as well as the rich, belong to the upper class and are respected and treated as equals, unquote. He realized that poor Southern whites in the U.S. would support the institution of slavery and the white planter class at its top, so long as they could look down on African Americans, both free and enslaved. Then Senator Jefferson Davis said something very similar in a Senate speech in 1860, which we'll include in the show notes. The latent resentment of poor whites toward the wealthy was thereby redirected to maintain the socioeconomic supremacy of the white planter class through white supremacy. We hope to do an episode later on racism, and we will go into much greater depth then about how capitalism exploits and even creates new prejudices in order to maintain itself. It is important to remember that the far right is never speaking or acting in good faith when it comes to ideas of freedom or democracy. When the mid-17th century English political philosopher Thomas Hobbes wrote his work Leviathan, he was arguing for the need for an absolute monarch who would defend individual liberty, and perhaps more importantly, private property rights. This is a man, again, who lived through the English Civil War in exile, so perhaps this is understandable. He argued that people would submit to the authority of the sovereign in exchange for safety and security of one's property. He even argued that by submitting to this absolute sovereign, the individual is actually more free than under a republic, because the republic is less able to protect the individual's liberty and property from the hindrance of other men. It is probably, on this note, not a coincidence that many evangelical Christian churches urge their believers to surrender or submit to God. As the fascist philosopher Carl Schmitt, who we've quoted before, would describe the phenomenon, quote, hatred of kingship and aristocracy drives the liberal bourgeois to the left, fears for his property drive him back to the right, to a powerful monarchy whose army can protect him, unquote. Yet by doing this, the people become what Corey Robin, author of The Reactionary Mind, would call actors without roles, an audience that believes it is on stage. The role of the people under a fascist system is to acclaim a Caesar and then be silent.
This is where, under fascism, the dictator in principle represents the will of the people, but the people have no direct say. The original Nazis were totally fine with winning an election, but their idea of the will of the people is to claim a Caesar, and then or in this case, a Führer, and then the Führer symbolically represents the will and desires of the people, and that actually what the Nazis called the Führer principle. Adolf Hitler basically became synonymous with Germany. Like Hitler actually at one point philosophically was Germany, and his spoken word transcended all written German law.
Well, this is contrary to what most conservatives may claim openly about desiring the maximum liberty for the individual. Conservatism has never been about freedom for everyone. Conservatives believe that there is a natural order to things that revolution threatens. Historically, Robin argues, the conservative favored liberty for the higher orders and constraint for the lower orders. What the conservative sees in equality, in other words, is not a threat to freedom, but its extension. For in that extension, he sees a loss of his own freedom. This freedom that reactionaries cherish is merely the freedom of business and property owners to exploit workers and accumulate wealth, and anything that interferes with this is tyranny. This helps explain the seeming incongruity of the way that many on the far right decry big government, but also love cops. Anything that is seen to threaten private property or support people they see as undesirables is bad. Anything that protects private property or keeps the poor in line through fear and hardship is good. Though perhaps we can put an asterisk on that in the post-January 6th environment where many Trump supporters have turned against the police for opposing their coup attempt and arresting them in the hundreds. They seem to have forgotten that if you attempt to violently overthrow the state, the police and the military will defend that state. That's why Mussolini and Hitler's fascists came to power through more or less democratic means, at least at first. Robin makes the case that the fundamental defining quality of conservatism is the defense of hierarchy.
Liberals often express bewilderment and consternation at the bizarre and irrational beliefs of the far right. How could anyone believe such things, or put themselves seemingly so far beyond the pale of reason? In large part, it is because these two groups have radically different ways of thinking about the world, based on different philosophical underpinnings. As Georg Lukács describes in The Destruction of Reason, explicitly anti-scientific and anti-rational ideology arises among classes or social groups when the findings of science and reason with regard to society threaten those groups' position of power. He details how this tendency first arose among the feudal aristocracy when their status was threatened by the rising bourgeoisie, the revolutionary class of the time, and later among the bourgeois themselves, as their status was threatened by the organized revolutionary working class movements. This is the 18th and 19th centuries. And because most people would not support fascists if fascists were honest about their goals, Adorno et al. Would argue, it was necessary to appeal to irrationalism and emotion to secure the cooperation of the masses. Although Adorno and Lukács, who were contemporaries, traded criticisms of each other's work, there is a case to be made that they were simply describing different aspects of the same thing. Lukács detailed the evolution of the reactionary ideology at the social and historical level, while Adorno and his colleagues were examining how these ideologies manifest themselves at the level of personal psychology and behavior. In order to really understand why the far right believes the things they do, it is necessary to go back to the 18th and 19th centuries. The irrationalism that underlies the modern far right was at least in part a reaction by certain anti-Enlightenment philosophers against the advancing influence of the scientific method over theology. Many of these reactionary philosophers believed, like Catholic philosopher Franz von Baader, that philosophy must begin with God, and were frightened by the idea of a universe in which human beings were not the center, and a divine hand did not shape human events. These anti-Enlightenment philosophers realized that if they tried to argue against science on its own rational terms, they would lose. So instead they argued on terms that were subjective and experiential, rejecting the existence of an objective reality independent of human consciousness. Nietzsche used the terms being and becoming to refer to unchanging and changing things respectively. He wrote that in becoming is manifested the ideational nature of things. There is nothing. Nothing exists. Everything becomes, i.e., is idea. And just translating that into layman speak, he's saying that the most important thing is experienced reality, not objective reality. And he's actually pretty much just denying that objective reality exists. That there is nothing important because it all is all filtered through your own experience of the world. And while this may seem absurd today, we'll try to put it in context. Materialism as a philosophical concept states that matter is the basis of all being. This is objective reality which can be studied and measured, as opposed to idealism, which states that consciousness is the basis of all being. Now, dialectics, which is invented by Hegel, is a form of analysis which attempts to find truth through a thesis, which is a positive idea, which conflicts with an antithesis. It's negative, and then overcomes that antithesis through a new synthesis, which is a new, higher truth. This is similar to the hypothetical debates posed by the ancient Greek philosophers Plato and Socrates, that you have an argument of point A argues against point B, and through argument between points A and point B, you get a new one, which is point AB, and then that becomes the new thesis. And then another idea comes along, and you have a new argument, new debate, and a new idea forms out of that, and then it goes on off into an infinity. This is why, pretty much every development in the history of philosophy is a reaction to one that came before it, and was influenced the one that came before it, and then influences the ones that come after. So dialectics was then modified by Marx and Engels into dialectical materialism. This is the idea that social and historical progress are driven by class struggle, rising from underlying material conditions. So to these philosophers who later influenced the far right, materialism was inextricably tied up with Marxism and workers. And if one is attempting to discredit Marxism, it makes sense, in a way, to deny anything that might help the Marxists make their case. So yeah, it's always been about opposing the left and the revolt of the lower orders of society. Naturally, these anti-materialist philosophers would be attracted to the immediate knowledge of intuition which does not require conscious reasoning. Rather than knowledge from without, like scientific method, observation, experimentation, intuition is knowledge from within. Think of that scene in Star Wars A New Hope where Obi-Wan tells Luke, "Don't trust your eyes, they can deceive you. Reach out with your feelings, Luke." That is an intuitive, experiential philosophy. Like the Jedi they're not rationalists. Intuition is very closely connected with faith. It's like how religious believers just know on like a gut level that God exists, which is why so many believers in conspiracy theories demonstrate a quasi-religious fervor, even if they claim to be atheists. They were also attracted to certain philosophical traditions such as existentialism, pioneered by the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, which focused on the existence of the individual determining their development through acts of will, and was opposed to the idea of humans as rational beings, as well as vitalism, a pseudo-scientific branch of biology asserting that living organisms were fundamentally different from non-living ones because they contained some immeasurable vital force, which was experiential in nature. For Kierkegaard, truth was subjective, and ethics a purely internal matter from which the outside world was a distraction. Vitalist thinkers such as William Dilthey made statements like, "From the standpoint of life, no proof can be obtained by proceeding beyond what is contained in consciousness to something transcendent. We are only analyzing that which belief in the external world rests upon life itself. Life gives the fundamental preconditions of knowledge, and thinking cannot reach beyond them." So these people, like the later existentialists and these vitalists, were just pretty much denying the idea that an objective reality exists, something which can be defined independent of human perspective.
Aristocratic epistemology. A key element of the intuitive, experiential, philosophical traditions adopted by the progenitors of the far right is what Lukács calls an aristocratic epistemology. While reason and the scientific method are in theory accessible to anyone, only the elect possess intuition. To philosophers like Friedrich Schelling, the job of philosophy was to maintain the subordinate position of the masses, and like priests translating the will of God to the faithful, so it would be the role of philosophers to create meaning, not the common people. He asked, why philosophy should be obliged to pay special heed to those incapable of it, and later went on to claim that the elevation of common understanding to an arbiter in rational matters inevitably produces ochlocracy, that is, rule by the mob, in the domain of the sciences, and with it, sooner or later, a general uprising by the mob. This sentiment was ultimately translated into what Nazis called the Führer principle, i.e., the words of Adolf Hitler were above all written German law, but was not invented by them. The term was first, in fact, used by Hermann von Kayserling in 1921, based on social Darwinist arguments that some were born to lead over others. In a nutshell, Germans were expected to believe that Adolf Hitler had all of the answers to Germany's problems, and that whatever he said was the absolute truth. If this sounds familiar, there is definitely something resembling the Führer principle in the followers of Donald Trump, albeit somewhat diminished after his loss in the 2020 election and multiple criminal indictments. This would explain his baffling ability, at least to liberals, to tell obvious lies and have his followers believe him, and to commit a multitude of crimes only for his followers to dismiss them as fake news. On to Nietzsche. We've mentioned Friedrich Nietzsche already in this episode. Nietzsche can be considered the father of modern irrationalism, and he had a strong influence on the development of the far right, including the original Nazis, as well as the works of Ayn Rand. Nietzsche believed that real civilization required a laboring class to support a leisure class that was the creator of all culture, and openly admired the slave society of ancient Greece. Remember, Plato owned 5 slaves, and Aristotle infamously defended slavery if there are those in society suited to it. He despised Christianity and socialism as slave morality, which dragged down the strong by encouraging an ethics based on empathy or notions of equality. He had a corresponding hatred for socialists for wanting to liberate workers from their exploitation, as shown by this quote from his book Antichrist. "Whom do I hate most among the rabble of today? The socialist rabble, the Chandala disciples undermining the worker's sound instinct, good spirits and sense of contentment, making him envious and instructing him in vengeance. Injustice," he claimed, "never lies in unequal rights. It lies in the claim to equal rights." He directly inspired the objectivist ideology of Ayn Rand by grounding his defense of hierarchy in social Darwinism and supposedly biological factors, also known as the appeal to nature fallacy. He wrote that were the predatory species beset by inner torments, they would have become stunted and degenerate long ago. If you really dig into far-right ideology, especially that of the Nazis and their descendants, the D word is going to come up a lot. To Nietzsche, hierarchy must be prioritized before morality, and that morality must be the doctrine which justifies hierarchy. This is the ethics of a ruling class. It is no surprise that Adolf Hitler himself later said that property can be morally and ethically justified only if we admit that men's achievements are different.
Brief side note on Nietzsche. We recognize that Nietzsche has a complicated legacy. Despite saying clearly anti-Semitic things, such as praising the blonde beast and describing his Übermensch, or writing ecstatically to a friend after the crushing of the Paris Commune in 1871 that not everything had to collapse into Franco-Jewish leveling, he actually hated anti-Semites. Specifically, he hated ideological anti-Semites like the proto-Nazis who were his contemporary. He likely would have hated the actual Nazis had he lived to see them, and would have said that their anti-Semitism was not their own, but rather absorbed from the culture around them. Originality of thought was central to his concept of the Übermensch. He actually apparently got so pissed off by their admiration of him that some guy sent him a copy of some anti-Semitic journal and sent a copy to him for his approval, and he just wrote back, "Stop writing to me, don't bother me, like, I will kill you." Apparently told them never to bother him again. His sister actually married a prominent anti-Semite at the time, and she's credited with editing many of his works posthumously, such as Will to Power, to the extent that I've seen a few articles arguing that he wasn't actually anti-Semitic, that was just the work of his sister editing his works after he died. So I guess you could compare him to someone who thought the KKK were a bunch of idiots for dressed up in white sheets, even though he himself held many of the same beliefs.
Nietzsche does sort of point to that weird contradiction in far-right thought, though, at the same time that there's the obsession with blind obedience. They all think that they're rebellious free thinkers, right? You notice that contradiction. Yeah. But also just the modern chud affect of fuck your feelings, like lions not sheep thing is just straight out of Nietzsche. Even if they've never heard of Nietzsche, it's all just cribbed from Nietzsche.
Yeah, which is ironic that they're displaying the same lack of originality that
he criticized.
Yeah, he criticized.
Indirect apologetics. Returning to what we had discussed previously in the anti-Enlightenment backlash to reason and the scientific method, one of the cleverest innovations of irrationalist philosophy is indirect apologetics. Apologetics of the direct kind are a defense of the faith, which you usually hear from theologians making their case for the existence of God and why the rest of us should believe. According to Lukács, in the ethical realm, indirect apologetics chiefly discredit social action in general, and in particular any tendency to want to change society. They achieve this goal by isolating the individual and by setting up ethical ideals so lofty and sublime that in the face of them, seemingly petty and fleeting social objectives would fade and disintegrate. In other words, if you can convince people that nothing will be accomplished by trying to change things, they will give up and simply accept the status quo, thus benefiting the capitalist ruling class. One of the best examples of this is the work of Arthur Schopenhauer, a philosopher known for his pessimism. He believed that people were doomed to aimless striving, and according to Lukács, that all historical endeavors were fruitless, especially if one approached the question from the perspective of how it affected their life as an individual. Another example was Nietzsche's defense of capitalism through its negative qualities. To him, the predatory survival of the fittest features were in fact positive qualities that were beneficial to society, a view later adopted by Ayn Rand and personified in the figures of John Galt in Atlas Shrugged and Howard Roark in The Fountainhead. It's actually a good thing, you see.
If one is attempting to argue against the idea that society can be changed, then it is essential that one deny the concept of history or historical progress. It is hard to understate the importance of myth to the far right in their view of themselves and the world. Kierkegaard, in attempting to defend religion from the advances of science, adopted a kind of historical agnosticism, according to Lukács. He wrote, "Let me use a metaphor to remind us of the difference between the ethical and world historical, the individual's ethical relationship to God and the world's history's relationship to God. The individual's ethical development, then, is the private theater, where the spectator is God, but also the individual man himself, occasionally, although he is meant in essence to be an actor. World history, on the other hand, is the royal arena reserved to God, where he is essentially, and not by chance, the one spectator because he is the only one who can be." Kierkegaard also argued that the more a man progresses ethically, the less he will be concerned with the world historical sphere. So he's basically saying that the idea that anybody can be controlled, that world history can be perceived and controlled, that's something that only God is capable of. That it is beyond the capabilities of people to either understand or try to change history or the world. This argument was attractive to later far-right thinkers because it cleared the way for the kind of myth-making necessary to nationalist and especially fascist ideologies. Ernst Jünger, who was a Nazi who later broke with the party conveniently in mid-World War II, noted that the victor creates the historical myth, implicitly rejecting historical objectivity. The Nazi ideologue Alfred Bäumler said, "The product of myth will remain hopeless as long as one clings to the question of how myth has come into being. For then one is presupposing a fixed basis to human evolution, and proceeds to ask how myth must have arisen within history. A satisfying answer can never be given to this question because the formulation is wrong. Myth is downright unhistorical. Myth reaches down not only into prehistory, but also into the primal grounds of the human soul. Now, this is the crux of it. Myth is eternal. Through myth, one can claim that a thing not only is, but it has always been. So there's no point in trying to change it, to tie back in with indirect apologetics. It gives legitimacy and a grounding point for any ideology. For the Nazis, myth enabled them to ground their racialist ideology in a mythical, pure Aryan race, in the noble, savage Germanic tribes that destroyed the decadent and degenerate Western Roman Empire. Seriously, anytime you ever hear somebody say the word degenerate unironically in conversation, run. It motivates the efforts of far-right ideologues to rewrite history curricula across the United States to erase mentions of slavery and push the myth that the Founding Fathers were uniformly Christian. If one denies slavery or its harms, it's easier to dismiss current demands for social justice and racial equality. If the United States was founded as a Christian nation, it is easier to legitimize the demands of Christian nationalists to hammer their values into U.S. law and the Constitution. Not only is the United States a Christian nation, it has always been so, they would claim. Their disregard for historical facts is not casual, it is deliberate.
Conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are by no means unique to the far right. Indeed, we could do an entire episode on left-wing conspiracy theories. But one cannot properly understand the far right without discussing them. Before we go on, though, we want to give a full definition of the authoritarian personality described by Adorno et al., because it will serve as a useful rubric for explaining why the right is so much more susceptible than the left. During their study, Adorno and his colleagues created an F scale, F for fascism, based on 9 factors, on which the higher one scored, the more authoritarian the person was. We've quoted the definition here in full. A. Conventionalism, rigid adherence to conventional middle-class values. B. Authoritarian submission, submissive, uncritical attitude toward idealized moral authorities of the in-group. C. Authoritarian aggression, tendency to be on the lookout for and to condemn, reject, and punish people who violate conventional values. D. Anti-introception, opposition to the subjective, the imaginative, the tender-minded. E. Superstition and stereotypy, the belief in the mystical determinants of the individual's fate, the disposition to think in rigid categories. F. Power and toughness, preoccupation with the dominant submission, strong-weak, leader-follower dimension, identification with power figures, overemphasis upon the conventionalized attributes of the ego, exaggerated assertion of strength and toughness. G. Destructiveness and cynicism, generalized hostility, vilification of the human. H. Projectivity, the disposition to believe that wild, dangerous things go on in the world, the projection outwards of unconscious emotional impulses. I. Sex, exaggerated concern with sexual goings-on. Using that as our framework, there are several reasons these conspiracies gain greater acceptance on the far right than the left. One is conspiracism, or the tendency to put primacy in conspiracy theories over more reasonable explanations. This would fall under factor E, superstition and stereotypy. It's a bit like a reverse Occam's razor, the principle that the simplest explanation is usually correct. Much like stereotypes, conspiracy theories help the ignorant make sense of chaos. The more ignorant they are, the more they cling to stereotypes that save them the trouble of thinking too deeply, while simultaneously allowing them to believe they are well informed. Conspiracy theories could also be considered forms of superstition. According to Adorno et al., superstitiousness indicates a tendency to shift responsibility from within the individual onto outside forces beyond one's control. It indicates that the ego might already have given up, that is to say, renounce the idea that it might determine the individual's fate by overcoming external forces. In other words, conspiracy theories are comforting because they tell the believer that someone is in control, even if that someone is evil, and it's not their fault, hence the proliferation of fear-mongering about groups who supposedly threaten an ordained natural order of things.
Another reason is the anti-introspective tendency of authoritarian personalities. This is factor D in Adorno et al.'s F scale. Authoritarian personalities don't want to think about how bad things happen, or especially to them. It might be the logical consequences of things they believe, actions they've taken, etc. So instead they look for external explanations. Think of the principal Skinner meme. If you don't know, this is references a scene in The Simpsons where Principal Skinner asks himself, am I out of touch? And he says, no, it's the kids who are wrong. Or the "Are we the baddies" meme, where there's a pair of comedians dressed as Nazis and slowly realize that they might not be the good guys.
Hands, are we the baddies?
Yeah, that.
It's Mitchell and Webb.
Quoting again from the Authoritarian Personality, the extremely anti-interceptive individual is afraid of thinking about the human phenomena because he might, as it were, think the wrong thought. He is afraid of genuine feeling because his emotions might get out of control. Out of touch with large parts of his inner life, he's afraid of what might be revealed if he or others should look too closely at himself. In order to avoid this, the Authoritarian Personality projects outward, factor H on the F scale, often in the form of moralism. Now, this is admittedly anecdotal, but if you've ever been to a city council meeting around here, it's, here being Olympia or Seattle, it doesn't really matter where, it's the same everywhere. You've probably heard a landlord or small business owner complaining about how the homeless people need to take personal responsibility, get a job, stop doing drugs, while they might be just sitting around drinking beer, collecting rent or surplus value from their tenants or employees. It's not just that the landlord is being a parasite by making their living gatekeeping a basic necessity. It's that other people are being lazy. Other people, not themselves. This is classic authoritarian projection. Then there is the fear of chaos. Given that people on the far right are obsessed with maintaining hierarchy, this is factor F on the F scale, and how they want to believe that hierarchy is natural, they see any attempt to change that hierarchy as threatening because it would destabilize their sense of order in the world. The fear of chaos is more salient on the right because the right has felt for decades that they are losing the culture war. They lost on desegregation, they lost on women's rights, they lost on LGBT rights, they lost on same-sex marriage, and they're losing on gender identity. That's why they're trying so hard to censor any materials that would tell kids it's okay to be who they are. Shut down Drag Queen Story Hour to try and maintain the supremacy of traditional values. This is factor C on the F scale. Having become accustomed to a high standard of living in the sense that their position is natural and deserved, modern American petty bourgeoisie see any economic crisis that threatens their livelihood or any demand for equality from oppressed or exploited people as an unnatural existential threat, rather than as a predictable result of the contradictions of the capitalist system, which the petty bourgeoisie have come to identify strongly with, no matter how much they misunderstand it. They simply don't think in the terms that would allow them to accept these demands for equality as legitimate, because to them, black people should be subordinate. A woman's worth is less than a man. There are only two genders, and monogamous heterosexual marriage is the only kind that exists. There's that appeal to nature fallacy again. A rational, historical, scientific view of society would reveal how unstable and contradictory capitalism is, how parasitic and untenable the position of the petty bourgeoisie, which offers a powerful subconscious motive to reject reason in order to preserve their sense of place in the world. Think of the far-right xenophobia and transphobia and continued obsession with Jewish conspiracy theories, to more bizarre beliefs like lizard people from space taking over the Earth, or the general belief that reason and science are suspect. None of it makes sense, but to people on the far right, it's preferable to chaos.
After talking so much about the far right and their susceptibility to conspiracy theories, we should acknowledge that there are many people on the broader left who are believers in conspiracy theories, particularly those involving distrust of the medical establishment, that's vaccines, biotech, the claim that GMOs cause cancer, or the federal government, 9/11 was an inside job. You can find a lot of people with progressive social values who prefer to find meaning and truth by using their intuition, who would also be susceptible to the kind of irrational beliefs common on the right. This is how you get yoga moms getting sucked into QAnon. Yes, that's a thing, and if you want to learn more, you should go listen to the Conspirituality podcast. You can also find a lot of people on the broader left with authoritarian personalities. Mussolini was a socialist before he was a fascist, because an authoritarian leftist is an authoritarian first and a leftist second. We might have to do an episode on self-identified leftists who broke right at some point. Had the Bolshevik Revolution failed or never happened and Russia became a fascist dictatorship instead, many of the same people who became devoted supporters of Stalin might have been devoted supporters of this hypothetical fascist regime instead. And there are those who, for one reason or another, have a pre-existing conspiracist worldview.
And having just said that, it's interesting how a lot of the people who make up the hardcore of the Putin regime in Russia are his old friends from the KGB back when there was still a Soviet Union. So interesting through line there.
It should not be surprising that far-right groups use conspiracy theories as recruitment tools, such as when left-wing media sources amplified propaganda generated by Russian state media that the 2018 poison gas attack in Douma, Syria was a false flag incident staged by a Syrian rebel. We've included the report from the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, which conclusively debunks this claim. It's a bit disturbing to see self-described leftists acting as apologists for reactionary and authoritarian figures like Bashar al-Assad or Vladimir Putin, merely because they oppose U.S. foreign policy. We discussed this kind of vulgar campism in our previous episode on ultra-leftism, or oppose trans rights as petty bourgeois decadence. Kind of makes you wonder if a few of them aren't infiltrators, but then we start getting into the same kind of conspiratorial thinking that drives the right, and it's probably best not to go too far down that path. On the other hand, attempts at infiltration by fascists are something we on the left should watch out for.
Okay, we promise we're getting close to the end. No, just kidding. We've got like 6 more minutes.
Yeah. Get ready.
Okay, before we talk about why a left approach to the far right would be more effective, we'll talk about why the liberal approach has been ineffective. One reason is that you can't fight an enemy that you don't understand, or are reluctant to understand. And we both remember trying to explain to people that Trump supporters have understandable motivations for voting the way they did, and that giving context for their choices wasn't the same as justifying them. You can understand their motivations, not that you agree with them, not that their motivations are legitimate or valid. To quote Theodor Adorno, people are inevitably as irrational as the world in which they live. Liberalism treats reason as an absolute rather than a relative signifier. They fail to understand that what is rational is based on one's material interests, ideological goals, and situational context. Hitler's decision to declare war on the U.S. was absolutely insane from an objective point of view, but rational if you are taking into account his belief in a vast international Jewish conspiracy. It really didn't make any difference. He might as well be at war with the U.S. anyway. It cost him the war, but his decision was rational if you go with this completely ludicrous premise. The perspective needed to properly understand the far right in a historical, social, and economic context, but also call the basic order of capitalist society, including liberal ideology, into question. That's why we spent so much time discussing theory and making this both our longest episode to date, and in part explaining why it took us so long to make it. So, liberalism has historically looked for ways of explaining problems that don't involve a serious analysis of class or the structure of society. In an amusing, if dark, irony, the liberal establishment fails or refuses to understand the far right for the same reasons that reactionaries seek to explain all social crises by bizarre conspiracies, namely an unwillingness to admit or examine the fundamental contradictions of class society. Now, granted, liberals within the Democratic Party have been forced to acknowledge class and talk about it a lot more since the 2016 election, but they are still misguidedly focused on the white working class that they don't fully understand, and thinking that this white working class is somehow qualitatively different from the black working class, or the Hispanic working class, or any other working class that people have a lot of the same economic concerns regardless of color. And this also leads to irrational, ahistorical beliefs on the part of liberals that present a funhouse mirror version of reactionary positions. Think of those liberals who just wanted to blame the far right in the Trump's election victory solely on Russian meddling, just as Trump supporters wanted to blame everything on immigrants, or liberals and ultra-leftists who view racism as this culturally and genetically ingrained trait of white people rather than an ideology arising historically in a certain set of conditions. This reflects an essentialist method of thinking, and you see a lot of this in the work of Ta-Nehisi Coates, not unlike that of reactionaries who seek to justify imperialism and racial oppression on the basis of culture or biology. Consider also liberals' understandable outrage at reactionaries' refusal to wear masks or get vaccinated during the COVID pandemic. This also makes sense in the light of the far-right petty bourgeois class outlook, which sees any appeal to the common good as deception and an attack on their privilege and autonomy. It is baffling to us as socialists why liberalism seems so determined to fight with one hand tied behind its back. The commitment of many liberals to open dialogue ties its hands when it comes to the unique threat posed by the far right towards liberal democracies. Instead, inviting them to write op-eds in the pages of the Washington Post and the New York Times. And in a previous episode, we described how fascism is unique in that it grows out of previously healthy liberal democracies because of the relative openness, only for the fascists to destroy that same openness once they're in power. Liberals refuse to take active measures to suppress the far right, such as those taken by Congress and the Grant administration to destroy the first iteration of the Klan during Reconstruction. This is in the late 1860s, early 1870s. Instead, they relied too much on norms and existing institutions to hold the line. Marxists, of course, would argue that norms and institutions are only as powerful as the organized political power backing them up. Many of the liberal elite seem to fear popular mobilization. Think of the character of Josh Lyman from The West Wing, or the reaction of the Democratic Party elders to the possibility of Bernie Sanders becoming the Democratic Party's nominee for president in 2020. We would contrast this to the reaction of many groups on the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, think Indivisible, Our Revolution, etc., which supported populist candidates Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren in the primary. Because liberals have ruled out everything else, the only thing that they can do is try to whip up fear of fascism. Now, we're not talking about you, our self-identified liberal listener. We're talking about liberal elites, the pundit class, politicians, TV hosts, etc. This can work in the short term. You can draw a pretty clear link between the fear of Trump and fascism and motivating Democratic voters to turn out to support Biden in 2020, between the Supreme Court's decision in striking down Roe v. Wade and the Democratic Party's surprisingly good performance in the 2022 midterms. But eventually people's outrage will fade, or they'll get outrage fatigue. You can only keep people worked up for so long.
Broad strategies. We've talked a lot so far about why liberal analyses of the far right fall short, and why liberalism is incapable of leading an effective fight against reactionary politics. Now we will turn to socialist strategies for defeating the right. In keeping with the materialist analysis, we contend that overcoming the threat of fascism depends not on mere moral superiority, but on building and organizing superior political power. We agree with most liberals that we should fight to expand political democracy, i.e. making Election Day a national holiday, expanding access to vote by mail, etc., but would add that we must provide a viable alternative to both the far right and centrism. Fascists thrive in a political climate of cynicism and despair where there seems to be no meaningful alternative to the status quo, and where those who have the most interest in building a better world see no realistic vehicle for their aspirations. The American political system also currently favors rural and suburban areas with wealthier voters who tend to support the right. We also agree on the need to strengthen the labor movement and the need to build off recent victories such as the Amazon labor union. But more specifically, we need a more militant, more democratic union movement in this country that will help workers realize their own power and build their class consciousness on the shop floor. Heightened class struggle at the workplace level, led by rank-and-file workers, will also more clearly demarcate the true battle lines in society, showing that neither the right nor the center have workers' best interests at heart. Shared struggle for material gains helps demonstrate the power of solidarity across differences of identity, and that bigotry is aimed at dividing and weakening us. We've incidentally included a link to DSA's rank-and-file strategy pamphlet in the show notes. Also, we should be less hesitant to build broad-based movements to win social democratic reforms, specifically so-called non-reformist reforms that take basic needs out of the hands of the market. The more people's basic needs are taken care of, the less the right will be able to pit different groups against each other with the perception of a struggle over scarce resources. The struggles to win these reforms will also help build working class organization, and ruling class opposition to these reforms will help convince people of the need for more thorough and radical change. Contrary to the paranoid delusions of the right, anti-fascism is not the mere opposite of fascism. Anti-fascists are motivated by a diverse set of factors, unlike fascists, who can generally be identified as a distinct type. Over the medium term, we need more propaganda work and ideological struggle to undermine both reactionary interpretations of social crises and liberal platitudes about restoring norms and so on. Again, norms are only as meaningful as the power that exists to uphold them. Combating the far right requires a historical materialist analysis of their origins in certain social strata seeking a favorable response to capitalist crisis. We must also combat ultra-left dogmatism that needlessly alienates people we need to organize. I've encountered a number of leftists who want to seemingly write off the whole working class because it contains reactionary white men, and this sort of thing plays right into the hands of our enemies. If you haven't already, go listen to our previous episode on ultra-leftism. There's some pretty spicy quotes from Lenin's left-wing communism and infantile disorder on these kind of people. On the note of that, it's like, yes, there are reactionary people in the working class. But that doesn't change the fact that as a whole, the working class is incredibly diverse and is the only group with the numbers or social positioning and material interests to actually challenge the status quo. That's the material facts. Your idealism doesn't mean anything. Over the long term, we as socialists believe in the necessity of building an independent party of the working class. Indeed, we could tie this in with recent decisions from DSA's 2023 National Convention to pursue this kind of strategy. We believe that ultimately the Democratic Party cannot be trusted to lead a principled, consistent opposition to Republicans and the far right because, despite their differences, they both share a fundamental commitment to capitalism and private property. As the great American socialist and labor organizer Eugene V. Debs once said, "The bosses already have two parties. The workers need one of their own." We should not underestimate the very real obstacles, both material and ideological, to pursuing the strategy, but the difficulty involved should not deter us from this urgently necessary task.
And I'll just second that and say that we believe in speaking to Trump voters' legitimate economic concerns, but we do not for a second suggest giving them a pass on any retrograde social views that they might hold. But to move on.
By the way, there has been some interesting research we should link to that actually shows that messaging to voters saying that, racism is a divide and conquer strategy that you shouldn't fall for actually does work.
Yeah. So we must be less reserved in articulating a more detailed vision of society that we'd like to build and how we will get there. Now, Marx and Engels famously resisted writing recipes for the cook shops of the future, because they understood that the shape of a social society could not be determined in advance, only by the struggles undertaken to build it. You can call this path dependency. What you end up with is based on how you got there. Nevertheless, it is more difficult to organize people without a fairly clear vision of a better future that can inspire them. There's been some promising work concerning institutional design, some recent articles in Catalyst, Eric Olin Wright's book, Envisioning Real Utopias, but more needs to be done. By and large, ideas of what life in a social society might look like have seemingly been confined to the realm of speculative science fiction. For what it's worth, we highly recommend the works of Ursula K. Le Guin, such as The Dispossessed, and my personal favorite, the works of Kim Stanley Robinson, in particular the Mars Trilogy and 2312, most recently Ministry for the Future. A strong working class party and an emboldened labor movement will enable us to build a historic bloc and wage a war of position, those are both in quotes, against the capitalist class. These are concepts articulated by the Italian Marxist and theorist Antonio Gramsci, and we'll link to a short piece by Harmony Goldberg summarizing some of those ideas in the show notes. Though he was rooted in the Leninist tradition, Gramsci argued that in advanced capitalist countries, different strategies for winning socialism are required, since civil society and parliamentary democracy give people a certain sense that the system is legitimate and can address their grievances, and capitalist ideology has become more deeply rooted. It is not enough to rule only through force or economic dominance. By contrast, the conditions before 1917 in Russia, where the state was brutally autocratic and had no real representative institutions, left little political room for moderate reformers and caused more people to gravitate towards an insurrectionary approach. DSA comrade Eric Blanc discusses this in his recent book, Revolutionary Social Democracy. The historic bloc, in Gramsci's theory, would be a broad front for all of the oppressed groups and the classes in society, with the working class and its revolutionary party as the organizational and ideological nucleus. Gramsci saw the need for the working class to win over these groups into its camp and away from the influence of the bourgeoisie. In our modern context, this, for example, could look like unifying anti-racist, queer liberation, and other anti-oppression struggles within the class struggle, articulating them as naturally linked, and in demonstrating that only by destroying the conditions of class exploitation can we build the conditions for true equality and liberty of all people to flourish. The war of position is a long struggle against capitalism that such a power base would be able and need to undertake. This would involve a wide range of tactics like continuing to build a mass party and militant labor movement, undertaking strikes, socialists winning public office, and passing non-reformist reforms like universal health care and social housing, winning the battle of ideas to convince the majority that socialism is both possible and necessary to build the fight and win a decisive confrontation with capitalism. And we must defeat capitalism in order to truly end the threat of fascism. This is where the Lord of the Rings nerd in me compares it to trying to defeat Sauron without destroying the One Ring. He's just going to come back later if you don't. Ultimately, the only way to solve the fascism problem is by addressing the root causes. This will be an intersectional, all-of-the-above approach. You can't meaningfully address the problem of capitalism and inequality without also addressing the social structures and prejudices that support it.
Yeah, fun reminder that in the US, the Communist Party was the main organization that was against racism before it was cool to be against racism.
And that back when they were building the broad civil rights movement that helped support Martin Luther King, like communist organizers were like one of the main driving forces, and that they had to distance themselves from Martin Luther King publicly because they didn't want red baiting to sap energy from the movement that they wanted to see succeed.
Rules for engaging the far right. Descending to the level of tactics rather than strategy, we had a few more granular thoughts on how the left should respond to the far right. It should be clear from our discussion of the authoritarian personality that you can't cure authoritarian personalities through psychology or rational arguments. Any propaganda aimed at persuading fascists must be based in emotional appeals, not logical or rational ones. 1. Never take a fascist at face value. They love to argue in bad faith and hide their true agenda. As the saying goes, you have to take them seriously, but not literally. If you notice them regularly using words like degenerate, purity, or tradition, that matters more than the specifics of whatever they say they believe. 2. It's never just a joke. Comedy is how fascists test boundaries to see what they can get away with it. If people react badly, then it was just a joke. If no one says anything, that emboldens them. It may also radicalize members of their audience toward the far right by planting ideas in their heads. For an in-depth discussion of this phenomenon, listen to the Behind the Bastards episode, Part 1, The Eternal Fascist, in which they discuss and comment on Umberto Eco's essay, Fascism. It also doesn't matter whether or not they actually meant it or were actually a fascist. The Swedish YouTuber PewDiePie lost a lucrative deal with Disney Company over anti-Semitic content in his videos. He said it was a joke and gave a weak apology, but the neo-Nazi website The Daily Stormer didn't care. Quoting an NPR article here since the original page no longer exists, some may ask, is PewDiePie really racist? Is he really a Nazi? Does he really want to kill all Jews? Who knows? He could be doing all this only to stir things up and get free publicity. Ultimately, it doesn't matter, since the effect is the same. It normalizes Nazism and marginalizes our enemies. If the Nazis think you're one of them or are helping their cause, you're doing something wrong. That's why anyone making these kind of jokes doesn't deserve the benefit of the doubt. 3. You can't compromise with fascists. They demand all or nothing and will break any deal they've made if they believe they have the upper hand. The very attempt at compromise also undermines opposition to them. Because fascists are ultimately cowards, losing tends to demoralize them. Just look at what happened to the most devoted MAGA supporters after Trump failed, or refused, in their eyes, to hang on to power by any means necessary. Obviously, there will always be a hardcore who carry on anyways, but there's really no substitute for outright defeat of Nazism.
Pushback works. Nazis are afraid of being outnumbered, and showing up in overwhelming numbers helps because they can't build up the confidence. Now, admittedly, the presence of law enforcement often offsets this effect. If you shut them down, chants are an effective tool for building group cohesion, and by drowning out whatever the fascists are chanting, you disrupt their sense of unity. And building off of what we discussed in the authoritarian personality, fascists fear embarrassment and humiliation because it makes them appear weak. We'll observe how Trump has used ridicule to undermine and support his GOP rival, Ron DeSantis. Shame them, mock them, do anything you can to make fools of them. Anybody notice how we have heard a lot less from Richard Spencer after he got punched on live TV? Granted, we can't in good conscience encourage people to punch Nazis, given that many of them are likely to be armed and protected by the cops. But on the other hand, that doesn't mean we don't love to see it.
Yeah, not losing sleep over it.
Yep. Related to the above points, we must also resist letting our justified disgust and contempt for right-wing ideas cause us to make knee-jerk reactions that end up validating those same ideas. For instance, some liberals and leftists, despairing at the persistence of racism, have come to see it as almost an original sin, something so culturally and biologically ingrained that it can never be defeated, rather than something that arose historically, in the context of economic and political projects by powerful interests, and that must be defeated by countervailing political power. Giving in to an essentialist and ahistorical worldview will always throw our theory and practice off the track. In Racecraft, Barbara and Karen Fields give a good example of this danger. Meanwhile, many well-intentioned believers in truth and justice succumb to biological determinism, the armor of the enemy, when they see around them the ugly signs that racism continues to thrive in our world, Weary of the struggle, they throw up their hands and declare that racism, if not genetically programmed, is nonetheless an idea so old and entrenched that it has taken on a life of its own. They thereby come much closer than they realize to the views of those they ostensibly oppose. Although it is now frowned upon to attribute biological disability to those designated to be a race, it is eminently fashionable to attribute biological disability, or its functional equivalent, to those demonstrated to be racists. Either way, Africans and their descendants become a special category set apart by biology. In the one instance their own, in the other instance that of their persecutors. We cannot let disgust at the evils of today lead to despair which cause us to give up the struggle for a better tomorrow, or to abandon our efforts to understand what is truly required to achieve victory.
Be careful about throwing the word fascism around carelessly. Back in the 1930s, during the original rise of fascism, Trotsky warned that to insist that fascism is already here, or to deny the very possibility of it coming to power, amounts politically to the same thing. The world fight against it becomes inevitably paralyzed. We interpret this as cautioning the reader that it's harder to fight an enemy you can't clearly target. But reasonable people can disagree. We've covered a lot of ground here, and what we've discussed isn't exactly uplifting. But we would like to end on a hopeful note. However much our country's undemocratic political system can give them an advantage at present, we should not forget that ultimately, the far right is not the majority, nor do they represent the majority. It is our mission and duty as socialists to organize and mobilize the true majority, the true people, the working class, to build a future worthy of humanity. As Ursula K. Le Guin said, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be unmade by human hands. We must remember that, contrary to what our adversaries believe, it is possible for people to understand history and to come together collectively and rationally to change it." With that, thank you for listening. Solidarity forever.